Chapter 124, Antony's Book, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu didn't think he'd ever been so miserable while reading before. Why did they ask for this? He couldn't stop wondering. Part of him was still tempted to see this as a kind of taunt, a reminder of happier times when he had behaved himself, well, when he had behaved a little better anyway, and been rewarded with his master's approval. Also, though this wasn't exactly a love story, there were a lot of tender scenes between the hero and their husband, and it was difficult not to suspect that this was the gods' way of telling Hanyu that they knew all about his wicked, blasphemous desires. All of that was probably nonsense. The simplest explanation was simply that his master was bored and wanted his attendant to read to him. A chance to provide useful service was doubly precious after all Hanyu's mistakes. He should be giving this task his all, providing the performance of his life. He should be reading like his life depended on it. There was only one problem. Hanyu's brain was stuffed full of Asao and Lord Marcus and Antony's injuries and the bewildering kiss and his forthcoming punishment that he was barely able to pay attention to the words as he read them, and there was no doubt that his performance was suffering as a result. It didn't help that the accursed satchel was sitting by the bed, right out in the open, seeming to mock him. Were Antony and Lord Theo looking at it too? Did Antony know what was inside? Hanyu could just imagine the god looking at him in bewilderment, wondering why he had brought so much misery down upon them all for some books and clothes. Just the thought of presenting the gifts he'd picked out was nauseating now. "Here, Asao, a pretty robe. I hope it's a worthwhile trade for your eye." Hanyu had never felt so low and contemptible before, which was saying something. "This is not the time to be dwelling on all this," he scolded himself fiercely. "This is a chance to serve. I need to show that I can be good." But every time he tried to pull his voice into something more than a low, miserable drone, it cracked and wobbled dangerously. He had been extended this chance, even though he didn't deserve it, and instead of making the most of it, he was ruining everything. The lieutenant grasped at his general's cloak, he mumbled wretchedly, determined to do better. His craggy face was lined with true panic. Yosuke had never seen the old soldier so rattled. "Please, sir, don't go out there. It's suicide. The battalion's lost." Yosuke undid the clasp of his cloak, which was woven on a crude hand-loom like all the garments of his day, and dyed with a mixture of crushed moon-lily roots and urine, and spurred his mighty war camel Shrike forward, leaving the garment in the lieutenant's hands. It would only get in the way on the battlefield. Was this General Yosuke the hero, or the hero's husband? Hanyu couldn't remember. He knew the name, though. Yosuke had fought for one of the ancient kings, back before the gods had handled most of the Taishin's warfare. Still, Hanyu certainly didn't remember hearing about any exploits as dramatic as this one. A Surgish foot soldier slashed at him, and Yosuke cleaved the man's head from his shoulders with one mighty blow. Blood spurted from the raw stump of his neck, splattering over Yosuke and his camel. Faithful Shrike screamed in seeming delight as he charged forward, as determined as his master to reach their trapped soldiers. Yosuke shook his sword to clear some of the clinging gore from the blade. It was a good sword, forged with the new technique of mixing bone into the metal. The practice had originated with the master smith Asao, and Yosuke felt certain that in another decade the old blades would be entirely obsolete, but he saw many of them laying on the battlefield next to their fallen welders, smeared in dying Viaskra and already teeming with hungry flies. Yosuke could only shake his head, grateful for the superior balance and maneuverability of his own weapon. There followed a page and a half about ancient weaponsmithing techniques. Hanyu found it difficult to believe that anyone would really think about all this as he rode into the heat of battle, but his voice began to steady as he felt some hope that he could be bored instead of miserable. Unfortunately, the lesson on metalworking was abandoned as soon as the general reached the battlefield. Hanyu quickly realized that, far from being bored, he would be lucky if he didn't have nightmares for a month. The man only lost his balance for a moment, but it was one moment too long. He fell beneath Shrike's hooves, his scream lost in a gurgle, and the sound of his skull being crushed under the war camel's fury, his brains pulping in the sand. One of his companions sprang forward with a savage yell, but Yosuke stabbed him straight through his open mouth. When he pulled back, his sword stayed stubbornly stuck, caught on the hinge of the dead man's jaw. Yosuke grunted in frustration and pulled harder. The sword pulled loose, sending his enemies— "Oh, gods, I'm sorry, my lords." His enemy's tongue flying into the bloody sand, the rest of his corpse crashing down a moment later. Hanyu was only too glad to be interrupted by a knock at the door. "I'll get it, my lords!" As he gratefully let the book fall and scrambled to his feet, he risked a glance at the gods for the first time. It wasn't reassuring. Perhaps he should have expected Lord Antony to look wan and worried given his injuries, but the god seemed unhappier than he had before, and Lord Theo looked no better, her forbidding face lined with tension. "Gods, I've been doing so badly, I even pissed off Lord Theodora." Hanyu shivered as he dashed for the door, remembering the animalistic twist of her face the night she'd rescued Antony from Marcus. He did not want to be on the receiving end of her displeasure. Luckily, the small god on the other side of the door didn't seem inclined towards anger. She beamed at him, enormous eyes brimming with so much good cheer he almost forgot to bow. "Hello," she blurbled as his head touched the floor. "You must be Hanyu. It's so nice to meet you. Raise your head, please. Can I come in?" "He says it's fine," Lord Theo called out, and Hanyu skittered aside to give the god room to pass by. She was holding a box in her hands, he noticed as he trailed after her. When she joined Lord Antony and Lord Theo in the bedroom, however, she gulped audibly and seemed to forget all about what she held. "Oh, Antony!" She sounded near tears. "You poor thing! I'm so sorry!" Antony scowled, a truly irritated scowl instead of one of his 100 others, and Hanyu's heart gave an inappropriately fond squeeze at the sight of his annoyance. The swelling around the god's eyes had gone down enough to permit for some very irate squinting. Lord Antony's hands flew, and the new god nodded along. Racking his brains for all the statues, illustrations, and tapestries he'd ever seen, Hanyu felt fairly confident that she was Lord Hilaria. The god's gentle reputation appeared to be well earned as she sniffled, surveying Antony's battered form with damp eyes. "Oh!" she gasped after a gesture at the box she held. "Right, of course! Julia said you wanted these." She extended the box, and Lord Theo took it from her. Antony peered over as she opened the lid to reveal dozens and dozens of pencils. It was strange to see the effect this had on Hanyu's master. His whole body relaxed, just for a moment, and he darted Hanyu a look so meek and hopeful it left him utterly confused. Antony looked like a child handing a pretty rock to an adored older boy, hoping his gift would be accepted and admired. What could any of it mean? Lord Antony signed some more, and Lord Theo turned to Hanyu. "He says these are for your friend." "My friend? Who?" Suddenly, Hanyu remembered a conversation from a few months ago, near the beginning of Lord Antony's ownership of him. Was it the first time his master had painted him, or one of the others? He'd asked for pencils for Jen, and Antony had remembered. All this time later, and he remembered. Those early conversations, awkward and meandering as they were, had meant the world to Hanyu. They had proved that Antony was taking an interest in him that he neither expected nor deserved. He had fallen asleep so many times, hugging himself delightedly on his cot, while he played over them in his mind, reliving every word his master had deigned to share with him. He'd always assumed that Antony forgot those conversations as soon as they were over. Yes, he was kind enough to talk with his human attendant, but why would he bother remembering anything Hanyu said? No one ever really listened to Hanyu. They nodded along and tolerated his endless chatter if they were especially kind, but they didn't remember his words. But now... You're supposed to take them to him in the barracks, but Antony wants you to take someone with you, Lord Theo continued, interrupting Hanyu's reverie. That was good. He'd been in danger of forgetting everything and falling into Antony's arms, heedless of the onlookers and the fact that he was in disgrace. He worked to get a hold of himself as she continued. How about Kenta? He hasn't seen the rest of your cadre in days. Hanyu bowed his head. Yes, my lord. Antony wasn't looking at him with that hopeful, appealing gaze anymore. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Lord Hilaria again as he moved his hands. Finally, she nodded. Yes, there was just one tank left, and it was terribly dusty, but he was delighted. Julia was so happy to see it that she let him start cleaning it up in her infirmary. It was kind of her to think of sending me to get it for him. Ever since everything with Dido... Well, of course Thad was wonderful about all that, but that only makes you feel guiltier, you know? It's been a little awkward. I was glad for a chance to do something for him. Hanyu was only half listening. Had he been dismissed? Was he supposed to leave now? How could he leave Antony when he was so badly hurt? What if he needed something? What if... Lord Theodora reached to touch his shoulder, then hesitated and pulled her hand back. Her gaze met his, uncertain. I'll take care of him, she promised, low enough to avoid interrupting Lord Hilaria. Antony darted one more look at him as he took the box of pencils and bowed his way out of the room. This look, however, Hanyu had no hope of deciphering. Bunta answered Lord Theodora's door. He seemed to be in a buoyant mood, whistling to himself as he went to find Kenta. Kenta himself seemed much less jaunty when he arrived, though he managed to smile at the sight of Hanyu, his eyes brimming with tears. Oh, Hanyu, he said, voice wobbling, and the next moment he had hurled himself through the door to grab Hanyu in a hug. I was so worried. I know that's silly because I didn't even know you were in trouble until after you were safe, but still, it's so good to see you. Oh gods, Hanyu, you must have been so scared. The hug and the tearful words had a strange effect on Hanyu. It was like when a child stacked blocks and added one too many, causing all the others to shift and sway before toppling. He went limp in Kenta's embrace. Hanyu only meant to nod, but before he knew it, he'd burst into tears. I was, he wailed into his friend's hair. It was so bad, Kenta! Bunta towed them back into Lord Theodora's rooms, where Hanyu crumpled onto the floor, unable to care about the eyes of the older attendants on him. He just wrapped his arms around Kenta's generous middle and buried his face in the comforting softness there. Gods, Kenta was amazing to hug. Marcus had a sow, and he just kept hurting him, Hanyu wept, practically stumbling over his own words in his desperation to speak. Maybe if he described it, he could stop seeing it every time he closed his eyes. He had him leashed like a dog, and there was so much blood, and then a sow was just lying there, and I thought he was going to die right there on my lap, and I couldn't do anything about it. Kenta stiffened in his grasp. But he's going to be all right, isn't he? Theo said he was going to be all right. Yes, but Marcus carved up his face and took out his eye. Hanyu shivered at the memory. He doesn't even look like himself anymore. Do you think... Kenta hesitated, breathed deeply, and pressed onwards. Do you think Lord Antony's still going to... Even if he doesn't keep a sow, Lord Thaddeus wants him, Hanyu assured his friend. But I think he would. He saved us, Kenta. Marcus was about to... He was going to... Hanyu fell silent. There weren't any words for that moment, the moment when the massive god had leaned in close with his coppery breath, talking about burning and crushing, and Hanyu had known that he was about to die horribly, and there was nothing he could do to stop it from happening. Gods, breathed Kenta. Are you all right, Hanyu? Of course I am, Hanyu said miserably. I didn't get hurt at all. A sow almost died, and Antony's tongue is gone, and almost all his bones got broken, and I'm just fine. No, but I mean, that was all so bad. How are you feeling? What do you need? What can I do for you? Hanyu didn't deserve to be asked that question. He had caused so much trouble and walked away without a scratch. He should have been worrying about Antony and Asao, not himself. At the very least, he should have been following his master's orders to deliver Gen's pencils. Instead, as soon as Kenta was finished speaking, Hanyu buried his face deeper in his friend's stomach and sobbed until Kenta's robe was soaked through.